Let me ask you a question before we go any further. When was the last time you actually tasted the honey in your kitchen, really tasted it, with attention, not just drizzled it over toast while half asleep? Because if you did, pulled a spoonful from the plastic bear, held it on your tongue, let it warm, and waited for the flavor to unfold, you might notice something that should concern you. Flatness, a dullness, a syrupy sweetness, without the wildflower complexity, without the hint of the specific plants the bees visited, without the slight bitter note that real honey carries from the resins and pollens bees naturally work into the hive. That flatness is not accidental. According to multiple peer-reviewed analyses, investigations by food authenticity researchers, and recent action by federal regulators. In the United States and the European Union, a significant portion of honey sold in mainstream American grocery stores has been adulterated with cheaper sweeteners, most commonly rice syrup or corn syrup derivatives, and the fraud is sophisticated enough that standard chemical tests often miss it. 9 honey brands, archetypes really, are most frequently flagged in this category, and the plastic bear in your pantry might be one of them. Honey fraud is not a new problem. It is a documented, decades-old, globally tracked commercial crime, and the term for it in the food integrity world is economically motivated adulteration. A 2013 investigation published by an independent food safety testing news outlet found that roughly 3/4 of the honey sold in major American retailers had been ultra-filtered, a process that removes pollen and makes it nearly impossible to trace the geographic origin of the honey or verify its authenticity. More recently, in 2023, the European Commission published results of a coordinated testing effort across 21 member states that found nearly half of imported honey samples tested were suspected of non-compliance with European Union honey regulations, most commonly due to the presence of added sugar syrups. The United States Food and Drug Administration regulates honey under general food labeling rules rather than a specific standard of identity for honey, which means that while selling adulterated honey labeled as pure honey is illegal under misbranding provisions, the enforcement apparatus depends on testing capability that not every lab possesses. A technique called nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy can detect many common adulterants, but the technique is expensive and not uniformly applied across the industry. Research indicates that the health claims often associated with honey, including antioxidant content, trace enzyme presence, and antimicrobial properties in certain varietals like Manuka, depend entirely on the honey being actual, unadulterated honey, and a product cut with rice syrup or corn syrup derivatives delivers primarily sugar calories without the functional compounds the label implies. Tonight we walk through 9 honey brand archetypes that have appeared most frequently in authenticity investigations. The economics of honey fraud deserve direct attention because they explain why the problem persists. Real honey production is constrained by the number of bees, the number of flowers, the weather, and the time required for bees to convert nectar into finished honey inside the hive. None of those variables scales quickly or cheaply. Corn syrup, rice syrup, and beet sugar syrup are industrial commodities produced at enormous scale at prices a fraction of real honey's production cost. The economic incentive to blend a cheap syrup into an expensive honey is measured in dollars per pound of product, multiplied across thousands of tons shipped annually, and the resulting profit margins on fraudulent honey can dwarf the legitimate margins on authentic product. That incentive structure has sustained honey fraud as a persistent global commercial crime for decades, and law enforcement response has varied by jurisdiction and era. The first brand is the iconic clear plastic bear, sold at every drugstore and supermarket in America for generations. The product itself is often sourced through a blend of domestic and imported honey streams, and the blending process, while legal when disclosed, creates opportunities for lower quality or adulterated source honey to enter the final product. Testing analyses over the years have raised questions about specific lots of this category and the pollen removal process common in mass market. Honey processing makes origin verification effectively impossible for the consumer. The ultrafiltration process specifically deserves a closer look because it underlies so much of the category's opacity. Ultrafiltration pushes honey through extremely fine filters under high pressure, which removes not only impurities but also the pollen grains that would otherwise allow origin verification through palynological analysis. The industry has defended ultrafiltration as a quality control step that extends shelf life and prevents crystallization, but food authenticity researchers have criticized the process as primarily a tool for obscuring geographic origin. The FDA has historically treated ultra-filtered product as still meeting the definition of honey, which some state attorneys general and consumer advocates have challenged. A 2014 petition to the agency requested a standard of identity for honey that would address filtration practices, but no federal standard has been finalized, leaving the category in the same regulatory gray zone it has occupied for decades. The second brand is a warehouse club bulk honey in glass jugs, sold at price points that industry observers have noted are difficult to achieve with genuine unadulterated honey given global commodity prices for real honey. When a product retails consistently below the actual production cost of the claimed product, either the seller is taking a loss, or the product is not what the label says. And in food fraud investigations, the second explanation is statistically more common than the first. The price point signal that consumer advocates emphasize is worth dwelling on. Honey commodity pricing globally has fluctuated based on supply, demand, and trade policy, but a reasonable floor price per pound for authenticated pure honey sits well above the cheapest warehouse club offerings. When a product retails at a price that cannot economically support its claimed ingredients, the gap between the price and the cost is where fraud lives. That is a general principle in food economics, and it applies across many categories, but it is especially pronounced in honey because real honey is so costly to produce relative to its syrup alternatives. The third brand is a supposedly local or regional honey sold in decorative glass jars at mainstream supermarkets, labeled with imagery that evokes a nearby beekeeper. In many cases, the source honey is not actually local, and the labeling exploits language that is not legally protected. Regional or local in the absence of specific sourcing certification can simply mean the bottling happened within the state, not that the bees ever flew within 500 miles of your zip code. Documentation of local sourcing is harder than it should be because beekeeper labeling practices vary. Some small producers label their honey with the specific apiary location and harvest year, which is the gold standard for transparency. Others sell under generic regional labels that obscure the actual origin. When in doubt, ask the seller directly. A legitimate beekeeper can tell you where the hives are, how many colonies they manage, what the bloom conditions were like this year, and whether this batch came from spring or fall flow. A middleman selling anonymous jars cannot answer those questions. The fourth brand is a budget private label honey sold at discount grocers, often in plastic squeeze bottles at prices 50% below name brand competitors. The same economic logic applies here. Real honey has a floor price set by global production costs, and products sold below that floor price are candidates for adulteration investigations. State attorneys general have periodically filed consumer protection actions against honey adulterators, though specific brand outcomes vary. There is a related phenomenon worth naming here called honey laundering, where product is shipped through intermediate countries to disguise its country of origin and evade anti-dumping duties or quality concerns. United States Customs and Border Protection has investigated multiple honey laundering schemes over the past decades, with some cases resulting in federal prosecutions and substantial fines. The pattern is simple. Honey from a country under trade restriction is shipped to a third country, relabeled and re-exported to the United States as product of the third country. Testing at the border can sometimes detect the original origin through pollen analysis or isotope analysis, but the testing is expensive and not uniformly applied to every shipment. The fifth brand is an imported honey from a country with a history of honey fraud investigations. Chinese origin honey in particular has been subject to decades of anti-dumping duties and persistent quality concerns, and product that moves through intermediary countries to obscure country of origin has been documented in multiple federal investigations. When the label says product of a country, verify. When the label says packed in a country, that is not the same as produced in that country. There is a secondary concern about residual antibiotics in some imported honey that has appeared in multiple inspection records over the years. Certain countries have historically permitted antibiotic use in beehives for disease control, and trace residues of antibiotics not approved for food use in the United States have been detected in imported honey samples. The FDA has taken enforcement action against some shipment containing unapproved antibiotics, and while the risk to individual consumers from trace exposure is considered low, the broader public health concern about antibiotic resistance through dietary exposure remains an active research area. The sixth brand is an organic certified honey sold at specialty grocers. Organic honey certification addresses the proximity of hives to conventional agriculture, the absence of synthetic treatments in the hive, and the handling practices in processing. It does not specifically test for adulteration with sugar syrups, and organic honey can still be blended or cut with non-honey sweeteners unless additional authentication testing is performed. There is also a deeper labeling issue specific to organic honey that requires attention. Bees can forage up to several miles from their hive, which means that hives placed in certified organic apiaries may still have bees visiting conventionally managed fields and bringing back nectar from plants treated with synthetic pesticides. The certification addresses the management of the hive itself, not the forage radius, which can create a gap between the consumer expectation of organic honey and what organic certification actually verifies. Honest organic honey producers acknowledge this challenge publicly. Less scrupulous operators let the consumer's assumption of total purity go unchallenged. The seventh brand is a flavored honey line, infused with ingredients like cinnamon, vanilla, or hot peppers. The flavoring ingredients can further mask the flavor profile of the honey itself, which in turn masks adulteration that might otherwise be detectable by taste. Consumers who cannot readily taste the underlying honey have no sensory check against fraud. The flavored category also tends to include honey that was never particularly high quality to begin with, which is masked by the added flavor intensity. A decent quality honey does not need cinnamon or chili oil added to be interesting. The flavor additives are often masking deficits rather than enhancing an already excellent product. That does not mean every flavored honey is suspect, but consumers should be aware that flavoring is one of the techniques producers use to add perceived value to product that might otherwise struggle to command a premium on its own. The eighth brand is a pharmacy and health food store honey marketed with therapeutic claims, sometimes including Monica honey from New Zealand or Australian varieties. The premium price for these varietals creates strong economic incentive for adulteration, and multiple investigations have flagged the Monica category specifically for fraudulent products sold under authentic-sounding names. Certification through programs like the unique Monica Factor Rating System or the Monica Grading System provides some verification, but counterfeit certification stamps have also been documented. The therapeutic claims category is especially delicate from a regulatory perspective. Monica honey in particular carries a cultural and pharmaceutical reputation in some markets for specific health applications, and the premium prices attached to authenticated Monica products create the economic incentive for counterfeiting that regulators have repeatedly documented. The unique Monica Factor and Monica Grading System certifications were developed specifically to address this fraud problem, and consumers purchasing Monica at premium prices should verify the certification rather than trusting the packaging claims at face value. Counterfeit certification stamps have themselves been a documented problem, which adds another layer of verification difficulty to an already complicated category. The ninth brand is a honey substitute or honey blend, where the product is explicitly labeled as a blend of honey and other sweeteners, often sold at lower price points and marketed for cooking applications. These products are legally labeled and not fraudulent, but consumers sometimes reach for them assuming they are buying honey when they are actually buying a majority corn syrup product with a small percentage of honey added for flavor. Reading the ingredient panel is the only defense, and on a blend the first ingredient is usually the dominant sweetener, not honey. The impact on American beekeepers of this entire fraud ecosystem is worth acknowledging. Legitimate domestic producers compete against fraudulent imports priced below the actual cost of producing real honey, and the resulting price pressure has driven many smaller beekeepers out of business over the past 3 decades. Colony health has also suffered from various environmental pressures, including colony collapse disorder, varroa mite infestations, and exposure to certain agricultural chemicals. And the surviving beekeeping industry in the United States is smaller than it was a generation ago. Buying real honey from verified local sources is not just a consumer safety decision. It is also a decision that sustains the pollination ecosystem that agriculture broadly depends upon, because bees that make honey are the same bees that pollinate the crops that feed us. Now, here is what you can do to actually get real honey into your home. First, buy from local beekeepers directly whenever possible. Farmers markets, roadside stands, and beekeeper cooperative websites let you talk to the person who kept the bees, ask where the hives are located, and see the product before you buy. The price will be higher than supermarket honey, and it should be. Real honey costs what it costs. Second, look for raw and unfiltered honey, ideally in opaque or dark glass containers that preserve quality. Raw honey has not been ultra-processed and retains the pollen that can be used to verify geographic origin through municipallinergy, which is the study of pollen grains in honey. Third, run the basic tests yourself. A drop of real honey on a plate will hold its shape for a moment before spreading slowly. Adulterated honey tends to spread more quickly because of altered viscosity. A drop in a glass of water should sink to the bottom and hold together before dissolving slowly. These are not definitive tests, but they provide informal indicators. Fourth, taste deliberately. Real honey varies by floral source, from the dark robustness of buckwheat to the delicate lightness of clover to the citrus brightness of orange blossom. If your honey tastes like nothing but sweet, that is a flag. Fifth, crystallization is your friend. Real raw honey crystallizes over time, and crystallization is actually a sign of authenticity, not spoilage. Commercially processed honey that stays liquid indefinitely has often been heat-treated and ultra-filtered in ways that strip beneficial compounds. Sixth, verify certifications that require independent testing, not just marketing language. TrueSource Certified is one program that has attempted to address authenticity in the American market. Seventh, diversify your sweeteners. You do not need to rely on honey for every sweetening need. Real maple syrup from a verified source, date paste, and fruit purees can serve many of the same culinary purposes while spreading your dependence across multiple supply chains that are harder to defraud in concert. The honey you grew up with, the honey that made your grandmother's biscuits taste like summer, the honey that you believed was the simplest product in the pantry, became something else while most of us were not paying attention. It became a commodity traded across borders through opaque broker chains. It became a canvas for economic adulteration that has been documented since at least the 1970s. It became a product where the label tells you almost nothing and the testing happens only when someone decides to look. But the good honey is still out there. The beekeepers are still keeping bees, fighting colony losses, and bottling what the hives actually made. You just have to step slightly outside the grocery store pipeline to find them, and once you taste the difference, you will not confuse real for fake again. There is also a cooking and baking dimension to this that home cooks should understand. Recipes calling for honey assume real honey, with the particular viscosity, moisture content, and flavor complexity that real honey delivers. Baking with adulterated honey produces subtly different results, because sugar syrups behave differently under heat than real honey does, And experienced bakers can taste the difference in a finished cake or cookie even when they cannot articulate exactly what is off. Using authenticated honey in your kitchen supports the craft of baking as much as it supports your nutrition. The recipe your grandmother handed down assumed the honey she used, and that honey was real honey because the fraud economy that surrounds the modern bottle had not yet fully developed when she was baking. The taste training aspect of this shift is probably the most underappreciated benefit. Real honey introduces a child or an adult to the concept that food has terroir, that the same product grown in different places carries different flavors, that sweetness is not a single note but a spectrum. A spoonful of buckwheat honey is a different experience from a spoonful of orange blossom honey, which is different from a spoonful of wildflower honey from a specific valley in a specific year. That sensory awareness transfers to every other food category. People who can taste real honey start noticing differences in other products they previously accepted as interchangeable, and the broader food literacy that emerges is the quiet dividend of this one small change in what jar you buy. The bees did their part, the beekeepers did theirs. The rest is up to you, and it starts with the next jar you refuse to buy because the label did not tell you enough, and you are done taking plastic promises at face value. The jar of the future is the jar you can trace, the jar whose producer you can name, the jar whose bees flew over flowers in a place you could actually visit if you chose to. That is what honey used to be, and that is what it can be again, one purchase at a time.